In 1893, a group of Egyptian farmers were digging on a small island in the Nile when they pulled something out of the dirt that historians still cannot fully agree on today. Not a statue, not gold. Thousands of pieces of ancient paper, handwritten documents over 2,500 years old, describing a Hebrew community living on African soil, running a fully operational temple, long before most people assume Hebrews were anywhere near this continent. The documents are real. They have been translated. They're sitting in museums right now. And the reason you have probably never heard this story comes down to one uncomfortable fact. After the excavation, the archive was deliberately split across more than 60 institutions worldwide, and not a single museum on Earth displays the full picture. This video is going to show you what that full picture actually looks like and why it matters more than most people realize. To understand what was found, you need to understand where it was found. Elephantine is a small island sitting directly in the middle of the Nile River, near what is today the city of Aswan in southern Egypt. In the ancient world, this island was not a quiet backwater. It was a border crossing, the southern gateway between Egypt and the lands of Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa. It was a military garrison, a trading hub, and a meeting point for multiple civilizations moving through one of the most strategic corridors on the continent. The island had been inhabited for thousands of years, but what the farmers pulled out of the ground in 1893 revealed something that almost nobody expected to find there: an entire community of Hebrew people who had been living, working, worshiping, and building on this African island for generations. Word spread fast after that initial discovery. Antiquities dealers arrived, private collectors arrived. By the time professional German and French archaeological teams reached Elephantine in the early 1900s to conduct formal excavations, a significant portion of the archive had already been purchased and shipped out of Egypt. What remained was recovered systematically, translated, and studied. And the picture that emerged from those thousands of fragments was extraordinary. Drop a comment below if you have heard of the Elephantine papyri before today. I'm genuinely curious how well known this is outside of academic circles. The people who wrote these documents called themselves the Yehudiah, which is simply the Aramaic word for Judeans, the Hebrew people. They were not travelers passing through and stopping to rest. They were not merchants on a seasonal visit. They were permanent settlers with homes, families, property, business contracts, legal records, and a governing structure of their own. By every historical standard, they constituted a fully established civilian and military community on African soil, operating continuously from at least the late 6th century before the Common Era, and possibly earlier. What makes the archive so remarkable is the intimacy of the detail. We know their individual names, we know their professions, we know who lent money to whom and who defaulted on a loan. We know which marriages ended in divorce and what the terms of the settlement were. We know what households owned and what they owed. Women in this community had property rights that were unusually advanced for the ancient world. A woman could own a house independently, initiate divorce proceedings, and appear in legal documents as a fully autonomous party. All of this is written out in their own words on papyrus that survived underground for 2 millennia. And at the center of this community was a structure that changes the entire conversation about Hebrew presence in Africa: a temple. This was not a modest prayer room or an informal gathering space. It was a formal religious institution with altars, a priestly class, ritual animal sacrifices, and scheduled religious observances. It was dedicated to their God, who appears in the documents under the name Yahu, the Aramaic form of Yahweh. And this temple was not operating in secret or under persecution. It was recognized by the local Egyptian authorities and later by the Persian imperial administration that controlled Egypt from 525 before the Common Era onward. A Hebrew temple on African soil running officially and openly for approximately 200 years. Among all the documents in the archive, one has drawn more attention than any other. Scholars call it the Passover Letter, and it was written in 419 before the Common Era. The letter was sent to the Elephantine community from a man named Hananiah, an official connected to the Persian imperial government, and it contains detailed instructions for how the festival of Passover should be observed, what foods are permitted, what is forbidden, the exact duration of the celebration, and the specific rules around unleavened bread. The reason this document is so significant is straightforward. It is the oldest known written instructions for observing Passover that exist outside of the Bible itself, older than any rabbinic text, older than any other external religious document on the subject. And it was found not in Jerusalem, not in the Levant, but on an island in the middle of the Nile River in Africa. For historians of religion, this raises a genuinely interesting question. The fact that Hananiah felt it was necessary to send these instructions to Elephantine suggests the community may have been observing Passover in their own manner, possibly in ways that diverged from what Jerusalem considered the proper form. Someone in authority decided standardization was needed. That impulse toward standardization, toward bringing scattered communities into alignment with a central religious authority, is itself a window into how ancient religions evolved and consolidated over time. Was the Jerusalem version of Hebrew practice the original? Or was it one variation among many, asserting dominance through institutional authority? The Elephantine archive puts that question on solid documentary ground. What is your read on this? Was the Passover letter a helpful reminder or an attempt at control from the center? Leave your answer in the comments because people genuinely disagree on this one. Now, here is the part of the Elephantine story that generates the most academic debate and honestly the most discomfort in certain quarters. Alongside all the references to Yahweh in the papyri, there are also references to other divine figures, specifically a figure named Anat-Yahu and another named Anat-Bethel. Anat was a well-documented goddess across the ancient Near East, a warrior deity associated with storm and protection, appearing in Canaanite religious texts, in Egyptian records, and in inscriptions across the region. But at Elephantine, she appears fused directly with the name of the Hebrew god, Anat-Yahu, a divine feminine figure linked to Yahweh. The version of Hebrew religion that became normative, the strictly monotheistic tradition centered on Jerusalem, defines itself in explicit opposition to exactly this kind of pairing: one God, no consorts, no divine feminine partner. This theological position was enforced through a series of religious reforms that biblical texts attribute to the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. But the Elephantine community, living far from Jerusalem and operating with significant religious independence, appears to have preserved an older layer of practice that those reforms had not yet reached or had failed to eliminate. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is the mainstream scholarly reading of the evidence. The Hebrew religion, as it appears at Elephantine, is not the religion of the Jerusalem establishment. It is an earlier, or at least an alternative form of the tradition, one in which the theological landscape was more complex and the divine feminine was present. Whether you find that surprising, threatening, or entirely logical depends a great deal on what you already believe about how ancient religions develop. But the documents do not leave much room for arguing the evidence away. The temple at Elephantine did not survive. In 410 before the Common Era, it was attacked and completely demolished, and the sequence of events that led to its destruction tells you a great deal about how political power operated in the ancient world. The island was home not only to the Hebrew community, but also to an Egyptian temple dedicated to the god Khnum, a ram-headed deity revered as the guardian of the Nile's source. The priests of the Khnum temple had long resented the Hebrew presence and the independent religious institution operating alongside them on the same island. Whether their grievance was primarily theological, territorial, or economic, the sources are not entirely clear. What is clear is that they found a willing collaborator in a Persian official named Vidranga, who held administrative authority over the region. The priests, in the language of the documents themselves, bribed him. With Vidranga's military backing, a force came to the island and tore the temple apart. The altars were overturned, the buildings were burned, the sacred spaces were desecrated. 2 centuries of continuous religious life were ended in a single violent episode. 3 years after the destruction, in 407 before the Common Era, a man named Jedaniah, the leader of the Elephantine community, sat down and wrote a formal petition. He addressed it to Bagohi, the Persian governor of the province of Judah, the administrative territory centered on Jerusalem. In the letter, Jedaniah describes the destruction of the temple in precise detail. He describes the community's loyalty to the Persian Empire over many years. He describes their repeated attempts to seek justice and rebuild, and he formally requests permission to reconstruct the temple and resume religious practice. He also notes, with evident frustration, that he had sent this same request before and received no response. This letter, written by a named individual over 2,400 years ago, exists today. You can look at photographs of it. Scholars have published full translations. The handwriting is legible, the arguments are clear, and the emotional weight of it, a community leader writing to a distant government official to ask for the right to rebuild their house of worship after a politically motivated attack, lands in a way that does not feel distant at all. Here is where the story takes a turn that directly involves how history gets told today. After the excavations at Elephantine concluded, the papyri entered the global antiquities market of the colonial era, and they were distributed in a way that makes the full story almost impossible to encounter in any single place. The largest collections ended up at the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, the Brooklyn Museum in New York, the Cairo Museum, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, with additional fragments spread across dozens of other institutions in Europe and North America, more than 60 repositories in total. No single museum holds enough of the archive to tell the complete story. No single exhibition has ever assembled all of it. When individual museums do display portions of the collection, it is typically a few selected documents within a broader ancient Near East section, without the context that would allow a visitor to understand what they are actually looking at. The result is that one of the most significant documentary archives in ancient history, a collection that documents 2 centuries of Hebrew life on African soil, a functioning temple, a destroyed altar, the oldest external Passover instructions ever found, a community of people whose names and daily lives we can read in their own words, is effectively invisible to the general public, not because it is secret, not because access is restricted, but because it was scattered before anyone could protect it, and because no institution has yet committed to reassembling the narrative in a form that people outside academia can actually engage with. This is a real gap. It is worth naming directly. We cannot have an honest conversation about this archive without addressing how it was collected. The discoveries at Elephantine happened during the height of the colonial era, when European powers controlled Egypt, most of Africa, and large portions of the Middle East. The assumption operating within that context was that antiquities belonged to whoever had the resources and connections to acquire them. Local governments had very limited ability to prevent the outflow of their own heritage. International frameworks for the protection of cultural property did not yet exist in any meaningful form. The Elephantine papyri were discovered by Egyptian farmers on Egyptian soil and now sit primarily in German, French, British, and American institutions. Egypt has made formal requests for the return of various antiquities over the decades, as have many other nations whose cultural heritage was removed during the colonial period. These negotiations are ongoing, complex, and often contentious, and the Elephantine collection is part of that broader, unresolved conversation. The question of whether the archive should be physically reunified in Egypt, digitally unified in a public database, or remains distributed across its current locations is not merely a logistical question. It is a question about who controls the narrative of ancient history and whose institutions are trusted to steward it. Stepping back from the political questions, the Elephantine archive offers something that very few ancient sources can provide: a ground-level view of daily life in a diverse, cosmopolitan community on African soil during a pivotal period in world history. The 5th century before the Common Era was a moment when the Persian Empire stretched from Central Asia to Egypt, when Greek civilization was at its classical peak, when the Hebrew biblical tradition was being consolidated and written down in its most influential forms. The people on Elephantine Island were not peripheral to that world. They were part of it, moving through it, negotiating with it, doing business across it. Their community included Egyptian neighbors, Persian officials, Aramaic-speaking merchants, and soldiers from multiple ethnic backgrounds. The documents record legal disputes between members of different communities, business partnerships that crossed ethnic and religious lines, and a daily social reality that was far more mixed and far more complicated than the clean national and religious categories of later historical writing tend to suggest. This is ancient Africa as it actually was: diverse, interconnected, legally sophisticated, and doing business in multiple languages with multiple empires simultaneously. That is not the version of ancient Africa that most American students encounter in school, but it is the version the documents describe. Not every question raised by Elephantine has been settled, and it is worth being direct about that. Scholars genuinely disagree about the origins of the community. The most widely held view is that they were descended from Israelite soldiers or refugees who moved into Egypt following the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 before the Common Era, and who subsequently entered service as a military garrison for Egyptian and later Persian rulers. Another line of scholarship emphasizes their identity as mercenaries who were recruited specifically for their military skills and who brought their religious practices with them. Some researchers believe both streams merged on the island over time. The exact architecture of the temple remains uncertain, since the papyri describe it without providing a complete plan, and physical excavation of the site has yielded limited structural remains. The religious status of Anat-Yahu continues to generate debate among scholars of ancient religion, with interpretations ranging from a subordinate heavenly figure to a genuine divine consort of Yahweh, with significant implications either way for how we understand the development of monotheism. These are active conversations happening in peer-reviewed journals at major research institutions. The evidence is solid. The interpretation is contested. That is not a weakness in the historical record. That is what genuine historical inquiry looks like. Some people watching this will ask why it matters. 2,500 years is a long time. These people are gone. The temple is gone. What difference does it make now? Here is the honest answer. History shapes how groups of people understand themselves and how they are understood by others. When the narrative of ancient African civilization is compressed into pyramids, pharaohs, and a few famous monuments, and when the complexity of African societies in the ancient world is left out of mainstream education, that compression has consequences that reach into the present. The Elephantine Archive is one specific, documented, undeniable piece of evidence that the ancient African world was more diverse, more connected to the Hebrew tradition, and more legally and culturally sophisticated than most popular history acknowledges. It does not require any theory or speculation to see this. It is in the documents themselves, translated, published, and available. The gap is not in the evidence. The gap is in how widely the evidence has been communicated. That gap is worth closing. A community of Hebrew people built a temple on an island in the Nile River 2,500 years ago. They ran it for 2 centuries. They wrote down their laws, their disputes, their marriages, their religious practices, and their petitions to distant governments. When the temple was destroyed, they wrote letters asking to rebuild. When those letters went unanswered, they wrote again. The documents recording all of this survived underground for 2 millennia, were discovered by accident, and were then scattered across 60 institutions on 5 continents, where most of them remain today, largely unassembled, largely untold, largely invisible to anyone who is not a specialist. That is the story. The evidence is real. The names are real. Jedaniah is real. Anat-Yahu is real. The Passover letter is real. All of it is sitting in archives right now, waiting to be read. Whether this story changes how you think about African history, about Hebrew history, about how ancient religions developed, or about who gets to tell the story of the past, that is for you to decide. But you cannot decide anything about a story you have never been allowed to hear. Now you have heard it. What you do with it is up to you. If this opens something for you, share it. And if you disagree with anything here or want to push back on the interpretation, the comments are open. The conversation is the whole point. If you want dedicated videos on the Passover letter specifically, the goddess Anat-Yahu, or the full text of Jedaniah's petition, let me know in the comments. Each of those deserves its own full treatment. There is significantly more in this archive than one video can hold.